Lions led by donkeys. The Somme is like the Holocaust. It revealed things about mankind that we cannot forget. It can never become the past. It is impossible to understand modern Britain without understanding its part in the First World War. The war ended at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. Every year since then, people in Britain stop what they are doing at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month and remain silent for 2 minutes. On the second Sunday of each November, many British people also gather at war memorials to honor the war dead. They wear red paper poppies to represent the huge numbers of these flowers which grew in the disturbed soil of the battlefields. The color of the poppies also symbolizes the blood of those who died. People still visit the war cemeteries in France and Belgium, where the graves of those who died in the Great War are lovingly looked after. On August 4th, 1914, Britain went to war against Germany in defense of Belgium, which Germany had invaded. But the real purpose of Britain entering the war was to prevent Germany dominating Europe and threatening the British Empire with the help of its Austrian and Turkish allies. Everyone expected the war to be short and glorious. The German Kaiser told his troops that they would be home before the leaves fall off the trees. In Britain, people said, "It will all be over by Christmas." Their confidence was horribly mistaken. This long, grim war was indeed over by Christmas, but Christmas 1918. By the time the guns finally fell silent, Britain had suffered huge casualties, 750,000 dead and 1.6 million wounded. The vast majority of these casualties were on the Western Front. Two opposing lines of trenches, stretching 760 kilometers from Switzerland to the North Sea, claimed that the huge numbers of deaths along this front occurred because the ordinary soldiers, the Lions, were led by donkeys, incompetent generals with no understanding of the horrors suffered by soldiers trying to obey impossible orders. The tragedy was the constant repetition of the same outdated tactic, the mass charging of enemy lines, even though the enemy was now armed with modern deadly machine guns. These tactics, used by both sides, resulted in maximum advances of just a few kilometers up until spring 1918. The British were involved in dozens of terrible clashes, the most notorious being the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, the following year. At both the Somme and Passchendaele, hundreds of thousands of British soldiers attacked in wave after wave, supported by massive gunfire. Foot soldiers, armed with rifles, bayonets, and hand grenades, raced across no man's land towards the enemy. But trench warfare gave the defending army a huge advantage. The British soldiers were met by a hail of bullets from machine guns. If an attacking soldier was lucky enough to avoid the bullets, he would have to face further lethal obstacles, barbed wire, landmines, and poison gas. On the 1st of July, 1916, the first day of the Somme, the British Army suffered probably the worst ever day in its military history. 20,000 dead and 40,000 wounded. At that time, the army still consisted of volunteers rather than conscripted soldiers. The battle continued until November 1916, by which time mounting losses threatened Britain's ability to carry on fighting in 1917. The British attempted to use their new wonder weapon, the tank, but it was too slow and often broke down as rain turned the land into a sea of mud. The dead and wounded, and even sometimes the fit, sank into it without trace. The chief strategist behind both of these battles was Field Marshal Douglas Haig. He was convinced that the Germans would run out of soldiers if he continued the attack. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was utterly against the tactics of his most senior general. His feelings are summed up in his comment that Haig was brilliant to the top of his boots. But, for a variety of reasons, Lloyd George was unable to remove him, and he remained in his position until the end of the war. And perhaps this was for the best. The way in which the war ended surprised Britain and its allies as much as it did the Germans. Using innovative tactics, Haig launched a counter-offensive that proved devastatingly effective. On the 8th of August, in what became known as the German Army's Black Day, they suffered 75,000 casualties, for very little loss to the British. Many German troops surrendered, realizing that no hope of victory remained. Germany's defenses were smashed in just 6 days. The joy of victory did not last for long, however, as people considered the huge sacrifices that had been made. By the 1920s, most people accepted that the fallen heroes of the war had been victims of a pointless struggle. And yet, throughout the war, the morale of British soldiers remained surprisingly high. Music and laughter had helped the soldiers cope with the suffering. Their songs have been described as a protest of life against death. The simple but powerful words, like those below, rose above the inhumanity of the war itself. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.